Well, that was fascinating. And I have to say, I took furious notes because I have lots and lots of questions. So there probably are questions from the audience, but if I can be indulged, I have at least a couple of things that I want to ask our illustrious speakers. So part of what you're both talking about in terms of the innovative work that you're doing is how, you know, what is the means by which you're changing the outcomes in communities. So in Bob's case, through the GSA and the Public Building Service, new criteria for where these buildings locate, you know, make a big difference. And as you pointed out in so many of your examples, the placement of your buildings are a boon to local governments who are looking to revitalize different parts of their community, part of potentially an infill strategy. But as Peter talked about, you really need a fine-grained mix of uses to get the kind of results we're talking about. So one of the things that's often missing in GSA projects is what? Housing. And the security requirements and the setbacks might make it even more difficult for that housing to occur. I know if you walked around Washington and you've seen how lively and wonderful it is, you might have accidentally stumbled into a federal precinct somewhere where suddenly it's very quiet and there's not much going on at night. I mean, that's because there are a lot of federal buildings there. So maybe both of you, but first Bob, can speak to what are the ways in which we can get housing more cheek by jowl with federal buildings?
Yeah, I can't, there are lots of things I wish I could do at GSA that I can't for various reasons that are boring and have to do with federal budget rules and laws and all that, but we're not allowed to develop mixed use projects per se on federal property. It's just not what we do. However, we can consider when we locate a building not just is it near a transit station, is it near amenities so that the employees can go out and get lunch during the day or whatever, but are they also, is it near some place where they might live? And one of the conversations we've had in a number of instances with federal agencies where, you know, this is true in private sector and real estate, which I've done, and public sector. Anytime you try to move somebody from one place to another, they're unhappy. I mean, it's because people get used to where they are. I mean, what's shocking to me is the number of times we actually have people in locations that I think are just horrendous. I mean, there's nothing there, but at least their commuting patterns get sort of hardwired in, and then you say, well, I'm going to move you someplace with more amenities. They don't want it. But until they move. And then 3 weeks later, if you dare suggest they might move again, they're totally wedded to where they are. But one of the things that we do know, and maybe we need good numbers, although I'm with Peter, sometimes the numbers don't matter, is to note to people that when often we'll say to an agency, we're going to move you from one part of the Washington region to another, same in other areas, they'll say, well, but all the people live over here. What you do know is that there is turnover in your workforce, and what you also discover is after a couple of years, people, even without being able to live right near the office, tend to move closer to the office if they can. It's more complicated these days because there are two-earner households, and so whose workplace are you going to move closer to in a lot of cases? On the other, anyway, the short answer is the best way we can do it is by trying to take account of where do people live. We've done, I didn't show it, we've used some of the software that shows where your employees actually live when we consider a location analysis. But I think one of the things we should do more probably is figure, are we moving our locations closer to some place where people can walk to work, bike to work, as well as have to move a bunch of transit stations to get there?
Yeah. Well, I'll take it up a notch to the regional scale. You know, in the Bay Area, the jobs housing balance. I mean, there's many layers to what you've asked. What you're really saying is unless you have a good mix, the streetscape is going to be dead. So it's not just about people living close to work. It's also about creating vital urban places. But there's another scale up, which is when you get a giant mismatch between the number of jobs and the quantity and cost of housing, you get huge commutes. And so we have in San Francisco, we have Silicon Valley and the peninsula in San Francisco where all the jobs are clustered because that's where the economic vitality is. And we don't have consummate housing there, and it's all in the East Bay. It's great distances, and there's long trips. So there's a regional scale of creating a jobs housing balance that has to be attended to, once again, at a regional planning level. And luckily, SB 375 is giving us the framework to do that, but all the cities on the peninsula are in rebellion. They want the jobs, they don't want the housing. So there's a big battle to be had there. And then when you get down to the individual city zoning, absolutely, we need mixed use. We know that. We need to mix housing. And yet, there's this fiscal drive to overzone for commercial, because at least in California with our tax structures, that pays more than housing. And so the incentive is always to overzone for commercial and underzone for housing. So there's some, fiscal and tax structures that need to be addressed in order to get us where we want to go. It's not a simple matter of zoning. The economic incentives are backwards.
So I realize it's a bit of a stretch, but probably in most of your communities, like in the Washington region, it's a bit of a coup to get GSA as a tenant for an office building, or to get them to do a location. And lots more places compete than ever win. How difficult would it be to make mixed-use zoning one of the prerequisites, along with TOD location, right, access to transit, one of the things that communities would do to get GSA ready for a potential tenant or a potential building?
Well, I knew Harriet had an idea. In there.
It just occurred to me.
She would have liked you to have come up with that.
All right, so one of the things I've started to say when I talk to public officials in this area and elsewhere across the country is this, that while I mentioned the executive order 13514, we want to be in TOD locations. Being in a TOD location in and of itself isn't enough, and I'm not prepared on behalf of, I represent the federal workforce. I'm not prepared to say we're going to put a location down just because it's next to a metro station. If I'll tell you what I am prepared to do. We are prepared when we build new federal buildings, and we're pushing this, not to put so many amenities inside the building that the employees don't have to go outside. That's something we've learned in Suitland, for example, was probably a mistake. There are 3 big cafeterias and banks and all that kind of stuff inside the building. But I'm challenging locations to say, if you want us to locate near there, we're prepared to be an anchor in a TOD development, but you got to show me some other plans. Don't just assume, if you put the federal government there, the bad news is we'll buy a piece of land, take it off your tax rolls, by the way, because we don't get taxed. There will be security. It won't be as lively a building as it should be, but you got to do something. Show me you got a TIF district. Show me you got a plan. Show me you're going to create a mixed-use area somewhere and use this to your advantage. And that's something that in some places we see this really well, and in some places we don't. In some places it really is I think if the federal government builds it, they will come, and that's not always the case. I keep saying we'll build a courthouse, take it off the tax rolls. Many of the people who come to the courthouse are really not there of their own volition, and they're not going out for lunch. That's.
Let me add one thing to this.
Please do.
Mix. I mentioned this idea of zoning for transit capacity as opposed to road capacity. If you zone for transit capacity, an interesting thing comes up immediately, which is you have peak hour arrivals and you have peak hour departures. Peak hour departures are always empty. Those are empty trains. I mean, the trains are full coming in and they're empty going out. And so all of a sudden you've got a huge capacity at these station areas if you just work your way through the numbers. And you get a natural balance. And so in suburban transit nodes, where it's normally seen as an origin, so the trains are full heading into the city, but they're empty coming out, the natural balance there is to add jobs. And the natural balance in the areas that are dominated by jobs, of course, is to add housing. So there's actually a rational structure you could use based on transit capacity. I want to fill all the trains in both directions most of the time. How do you do that? How do you optimize your investment? If you did that, you'd actually have a very interesting framework for rethinking exactly what you're saying. Not an ambiguous mixed use is good, but an actual, you know, verifiable, this is the kind of mixed use and this is the kind of new development we need in this zone in order to balance things.
I'm sure that's warming the cockles of the hearts of many of the folks from transit agencies around the country. That's a big issue. How do we have all of this off-peak capacity? If we could only use it more efficiently, it would put every transit system on a much sounder footing. So of the many interesting things you said, that was a very, very intriguing thing about actually zoning around transit capacity. Let me ask one more question before I turn it over to our audience to see if they have any questions for you. And that has to do with the whole notion of infill. Both of you talked a little bit about your role in infill. And you presented some numbers from Chris Nelson showing that in terms of single-family, large lot detached product, that we've met our national demand and then some with the stock that's already built. You've made a career, Peter, in part, doing a lot of really innovative retrofit of, what would I call them, obsolete retail formats, dead malls in particular, among other things. What is the way we retrofit the cul-de-sac?
Oh, geez. I'm too old. I want somebody else to take that one on. I'm too old and scared. I mean, it's a frightening proposition there, and you don't know exactly how bad it's going to get. I mean, are you going to have whole neighborhoods that are so vacant that you could actually go in and really do wholesale development? I will give you one case in study though, because we did the regional planning for Louisiana after the hurricanes, and we didn't get to touch New Orleans. It's a different deal, but I looked over the shoulder at everything happening there. Even though there were some neighborhoods that only had 20% occupancy left, you still couldn't touch the basic fabric. So I think that these areas, unfortunately, will remain physically what they are. Will the houses be, you know, two families instead of one? Probably. Granny flats and second units and income units will evolve in that building fabric. But wholesale demolition, even in a place like New Orleans where nature did it for them, it's very hard to bring about change. And I don't think it's necessary, to tell you the truth. I think if we just go to the arterials and the strip commercial zones and we backfill good stuff there, we'll get to the right kind of balance that we need. And we don't need to invade those single-family neighborhoods, and Lord help you if you try to. I'm 100% behind you, but 100 yards behind you.
I think, you know, one other thing I'm going to notice, I think suburban office parks are going to redevelop. You're seeing in New York, office buildings turned into residential. You know, the trend that I started to talk about, and I don't want to play it all the way out, and then I'll end on a Pollyanna note, which is terribly unlike me, but the thing I didn't mention about our GSA headquarters building that we're redoing, we've had 2,600 people assigned to that building for as long as anyone can remember. When we're through renovating it, we are going to assign to it every GSA employee in the Washington region, and that's a little over 6,000. And the short story here is that there's enough space doing that actually to assign everybody a workstation. A smaller workstation, and given what I said, that on any given day 30% of them aren't there anyway, you may have too much space. I think you're going to see in the suburbs there are an awful lot of private sector firms adopting the same kind of space standards, recognition that people work differently, and I think you're going to see that we may not only have overbuilt the single family home, we may have overbuilt the suburban office building, and I think things are going to move. And the Pollyanna note I'll end with is that just as people don't like to move the location of their office, when we start out telling people that we're going to move them into this, what's basically an urban style office environment, meaning more people on the floor without partitions between them and all that, they all go in kind of kicking and screaming. And well, I got to say, and many of you have probably seen this, not everybody loves it. Many more people end up loving it than don't, and end up saying, wow, I'm more productive, I actually like it. And the weird thing is they end up saying, gee, you know, I really like coming to the office, which is a very different thing. And I think that's going to be a huge office trend. I think people who move into cities, if cities can maintain their education systems, you're going to see a lot denser things in inner suburbs and cities too. Anyway, I think that the bottom line is people are social animals, as David Brooks just written in a book, and some of that plays out when you get people in denser locations. It turns out they actually like it, much to their surprise.
Great. Well, it turns out, I mean, when I introduced you, I mentioned that you're also responsible for disposition. Maybe that chart that Frank Giblin put together that showed your location vis-a-vis transit, you know, with a few selected dispositions, your portfolio might be get even more transit-oriented.
I think that's the way it's heading.
Excellent. Any questions from the audience? Anyone want to step up to a microphone? One in the back there, sir. Just identify yourself if you don't mind and speak into the mic.
My name is Rick Rybeck. I'm with Just Economics here in Washington, D.C. I want to thank all three of you up at the front for coming up with very inspiring information and good numbers. Just wanted to address the problem of our willful ignorance of numbers and facts. And I think part of the issue is that it's our job to take your good numbers and facts and turn those into stories that are compelling and that move people emotionally to be where they want to be. I know I was, in a former life, I worked with the District Department of Transportation, and we helped create a performance-based parking pricing zone around the new ballpark stadium because we were afraid that with games starting at rush hour, a lot of people would drive and park at the curb in this area and create gridlock. So we put in smart meters that charged the typical $1 or $2 an hour for the first hour, but during game times, the second hour and the third hour reach $8 an hour. And when we mentioned this to the press, the guy from the Washington Post said, well, who the hell do you think is going to pay $8 an hour to park at the curb? And we said, that's the point. And I think the important thing is that a lot of these numbers and prices that we talk about, we need to find a compelling way to get the message across. And for performance-based parking, the slogan that we used with some success in our community was, it's more about getting into your head than getting into your pocket. Because prices are information. It's not just money. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any comments?
I agree. In politics, you know, you always know you've got to illustrate things with good stories, and I think that's right. We're learning more and more, by the way, on data. It's sort of depressing that people looking at this, people come to data with a certain mindset, and it almost doesn't matter what the data show. And but you can move them a little bit with human interest stories and how it really affects them. Maybe we do need to get better.
But you know, the problem with that, and I applaud that notion, the problem is that once you get into the world of anecdotes, they're you know, anecdotes to prove our vantage point. There are anecdotes that prove the reverse. You know, it's a little bit like the climate change debate. There's 3% who are generating anecdotes about how it's false,
right?
That there is no. But once you're in the world of anecdotes, those anecdotes are just as valid as ours. You know, just so happens that those anecdotes represent just 2% of the reality. Yeah. But you know, and so there's a catch-22 in this. I haven't figured out.
Right. I mean, I realize that you're talking hearts and minds, but I think there is a very open-minded audience to the numbers that you're talking about, and that would be municipal governments, local governments who are struggling to balance their budgets. So the idea that they can invest $1 and get $5 worth of benefits across all their most important things, I think that at least in a lot of places that there is a real receptivity to that. And then the places that are successful being more livable places, you know, they attract investment, they attract people. I mean, one of the things we're proudest of in the District of Columbia is that after 5 decades, we had a decade of growth last year. 30,000 new people, 5% growth, and for us, that was very validating of our investments in transportation and in placemaking. But we have another question.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. DOT, EPA, and HUD have been talking with each other about livable communities. Has GSA been part of that conversation? Yeah,
the DOT, EPA, and HUD have a group called the what's it called, Sustainable Partnership or some, and they're kind of letting us be an adjunct. I mean, they're doing a great job together, and yes, but we're meeting with them all the time and trying to coordinate policies.
How does that work, all these agencies?
Actually, I got to say, I don't think they actually thought of us as, you know, we had to kind of elbow our way in at first, but I think they, because, you know, like I said, who the hell is GSA? You know, what do you guys do? And it turned out, I think, when they figured out that we have this inventory that could make a difference, we felt pretty welcome. We happen to know, I mean, you know, Sean Donovan, I got to say, at HUD really gets it. John Percari and Secretary Hood both both get it, and I think Lisa Jackson. Anyway, the EPA people are really you know, we're working together a lot.
Next question.
Hi, Soren Simonson from Salt Lake City. I'm an architect, an urban designer, city planner, and also serve on the city council. It's wonderful to hear this conversation today, and good to see you again, Peter. Thank you for your great work with Envision Utah and the Salt Lake City region over the last many years. The question that I have, and also maybe a comment, is looking at the information that Peter presented on changes in demographics and housing types. And you cited some research that has been done by Chris Nelson over the last few years, which shows subtle shifts, although I think still very significant shifts in the number of multifamily dwelling units and the demand for that. One of the factors, and I've actually been talking to him about this and others at the University of Utah in the research, is that it appears that we're not really factoring in what limitations on natural resources are going to play into that over the period of the next 20 to 40 years, which is kind of the horizon that we're doing a lot of our long-range planning right now. And the fact that we may be approaching 9 or 10 billion people worldwide, 2 to 3 billion more than we have today, and the affluence and the consumption of resources is also escalating in the same way that VMT and other suburban consumption rates are escalating. And it leaves me wondering that if single-family homes may still be 40% of our housing stock in a lot of the long-range projections, where on earth is the timber going to come from to build those homes and the petroleum products to pave the roads and distribute all of those products? And so I think we are greatly underestimating the limitations of natural resources, and I'm curious to know if there's conversation going on right now, either within the GSA or in other planning realms, that's focused on long-range plans and how limitations of resources are going to begin to dramatically affect the way that we think about and plan. And obviously the focus on efficiency in office, efficiency in home design, efficiency in transportation systems is part of that, and I think that can be a much more perhaps much more compelling.
Yeah, I think,
yeah, much more compelling.
In our
reason.
I'll just say in GSA, in our little part of the world, I mean, there's been this inexorable rise in the amount of space that the federal government consumes. There's been an inexorable rise in the number of employees, quite honestly, particularly the last 10 years with the wars and Homeland Security. And we don't assume that's going to happen anymore. We assume that the amount of space that we're going to control is actually going to stabilize this year and then start shrinking. Now, I don't know that that's going to happen in housing. I'll just say one other thing that just sort of struck me. You know, during the building boom that, ended so precipitously 3 years ago, the Chinese, Peter talked about, what happens if they hold to a 3-story model. You know, there was a time when you couldn't build because there was no gypsum, because the Chinese were building so much that we didn't have any. It was frightfully expensive. It drove up building costs. It was the first, but I think only the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to see when that part of the world really starts to compete for the resources like oil that we've always assumed we could have at whatever price we want.
You know, the Envision Utah is a good example of what you're talking about, but they're separate vectors. There's the market demand vector, which Chris is talking about, and then there's the environmental capacity, and then there's the economics. All three of those vectors point in the same direction. So it's not as if you have to say, let's listen to one over the other, or we're not measuring one or the other. We actually in Envision Utah measured all three of those. Often natural resources translates into economics if you have a reasonable extrapolation of cost. And that happened. One of the big reasons that I think we were successful in Salt Lake was that we were able to demonstrate that the infrastructure costs got so large for more and more sprawl. And that, of course, the sprawl was, resource intensive. And that translated into dollars, and dollars are what the Republicans in your state legislature could understand and empathize with, and made them actually
Can I ask you, was what worked, what I heard, the conventional myth about Envision Utah, is that it was when they realized the cost of bringing water to all those people was more surprising even than the road infrastructure and that kind of stuff.
It was an accumulation of various factors. We did a study like a Chris Nelson study that identified or popped the bubble on the myth that all Mormons want large lot single family homes. It turns out that there are some young ones that don't have kids yet, hard for them to imagine, and there are some older ones that actually have gotten the kids out of the house, also hard for them to imagine. But there's there was a whole bunch of myths there. So it was the fact that I think the most profound thing actually in Salt Lake was that there was a culture that cared about the next generation. And when we showed all this data on what the impacts were going to be 30 and 40 years out, they emotionally connected to that as that's going to impact my kids. My kids, I want my kids to stay here. Too many communities in America today, this idea of mobility is a way of avoiding consequences. And so people, their attitude is, well, this place may be totally screwed up, but that's okay. My kids will go somewhere else and they'll, find a better place. But I think at its heart, there were many vectors: water, infrastructure cost, market demand. Open space was a big one. Many people there really cherished the open space on the Wasatch back and didn't want to see it invaded with sprawl. There were many factors, but what it really boiled down to was this fundamental ethos about caring about the next generation.
I think that's a really important point, and I think that when you're talking about the message, I think you have to know the values are different in different communities, and so understanding who you're talking to and what their value system is, and then being able to relate. You have a value system at GSA and in the Congress, and you have to frame your conversation in those terms. I can want what I want in terms of mixed-use zoning that I'd like you to force me to do, and a lot of my colleagues around the country, but we have to be able to put it into that frame. Right. But I hate to cut off the conversation, but everyone has been very indulgent. We've let us run 15 minutes over. I think these gentlemen will be here for another couple of minutes if you'd like to speak to them further. But Peter Calthorpe, I know you have not nearly gotten enough of him. He will be signing this book, Urbanism in the Age of Climate Change, out at the bookstore, by the registration desk, probably in about 15 minutes. So please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you, Harriet.